Welcome everyone to today's SEI Live. I'm Laura Champion, Managing Director of SEI and Global Partnerships at IStructE. Today's topic is sustainability and what is our role as a structural engineer in the structural engineering community in this global topic, its future in our profession, and the importance of global collaboration, including support of programs such as SEI's SE 2050 Net Zero Commitment Plan and UK's Structural Engineers Declare. Our panel will be hosted today by Glenn Bell, who is currently SEI's past president and also just ended his term as an IStructE director and a council member. Our panel members include SEI Sustainability co-chairs and IStructE's new head of climate action. Our today's discussion, and thank you for joining today's discussion and for attending. And I'll see you in the chat. Don't forget to put your questions in the chat. Glenn will now introduce today's guests, Will Arnold, Megan Stringer, and Mark Webster. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yes, thank you, Laura, and welcome everyone. The sustainability of our planet, and in particular climate change, is perhaps the most pressing societal issue of our time. Few people outside of those of us who work in the built environment understand the impact on our planet of what we design, build, and maintain. Buildings and other construction account for about 40% of CO2 emissions worldwide. As professionals, we must take responsibility for our actions. And now that we're back in the Paris Agreement here in the US, we can expect to have the full backing of our government. I hope you've been looking forward to today's session as much as I have. I'm pleased to welcome 3 prominent structural engineering sustainability leaders, 2 from the US and 1 from the UK, who are going to help us understand the sustainability challenge and what we need to do to meet it. Will Arnold is the incoming head of climate action at the Institution of Structural Engineers. The institution is the UK analog of our SEI here in the US. Will's appointment as head of climate action follows a part-time institution appointment, which he held on this topic in the last 6 months. Before that, Will worked as a practicing engineer at Arup, where he was responsible for key aspects of ambitious architectural projects across the world, from the UK to Taiwan and Rwanda. In his institution role, Will hopes to embed climate emergency response into all aspects of the institution's work, as well as leading the publication of best practice guidance for institution membership. Megan Stringer is an associate principal with Home Structures in San Francisco. As the firm's in-house sustainability expert, Megan brings a keen eye for reducing a structure's embodied carbon and the elimination of unnecessary materials. Megan is versed in working with large design teams and led the structural design for the largest mass timber project in North America. Megan is active in sustainability design and serves as co-chair of the ASCE SEI Sustainability Committee. On the Sustainability Committee, she's helped in the development of the recently launched SEI SE 2050 Commitment Program, which is an embodied carbon reduction program aimed at the structural engineering profession to achieve net zero carbon structures by 2050. Mark Webster is a structural engineer at Simpson, Gumpertz & Hager in the Boston area. He's a founding member and, with Megan Stringer, is co-chair of the SEI Sustainability Committee, and he chairs the committee's Carbon Working Group. Mark recently edited and co-authored the committee's technical report addressing the climate impacts of structural materials, which is entitled Structural Materials and Global Climate, as well as the working group's white paper, Achieving Net Zero Embodied Carbon in the Structural Materials by 2050. Mark also heads the resources subgroup of SEI 2050 subcommittee. Welcome, Will and Megan and Mark. I'd like to lay the groundwork here for our discussion by asking you to offer some definitions of terms and briefly talk about what your respective organizations are working on. To those of you listening in, please don't forget to submit your questions via the chat. So Mark, could you kick us off by telling us what sustainability is and means in the context of structural engineering, and maybe review some of SEI's activities in this area?
Yeah, sure, Glenn. Thanks for the great introduction. I agree that climate change is certainly the most burning issue we're facing right now in sustainability, but it's not the only issue. And to me, to really thinking about sustainability, we need to think long term. It's not just the next 20 years, next 30 years, it's the next 100, maybe the next 1,000 years. Literally how do we have true sustainability? And that gets at some pretty big questions. Does it mean no extraction of raw materials, everything goes into sort of a circular economy? Maybe long term, those are things that will be essential for us to maintain our standard of living. But it's more than just materials. It's maintaining and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity and having a healthy planet for people and other life living here. So a lot of big issues. On the Sustainability Committee, we are tackling a few of these issues, certainly not all of them, and there's always room to do more. In addition to climate change, we have working groups addressing a few other issues, and I'll just give some samples of some of the work we're doing. Recently, we formed an ad hoc subgroup to review and comment on the new ASCE 73 standard requirements for sustainable infrastructure was one recent project, and hopefully gave them some constructive comments for that standard. We have a number of working groups. We have an infrastructure working group, which is looking at not just buildings, but other built infrastructure that structural engineers are involved in. And right now they're working on a paper that they've submitted to the upcoming International Conference on Sustainable Infrastructure. We have a disaster resilience working group trying to figure out, untangling the relationship between resilience and carbon emissions right now. And I'll talk a little more about resilience in just a second. We have a thermal bridging working group. This has recently been jump-started again after some time, which is focusing on thermal bridging in buildings in the envelope, and looking at code language, education for the structural engineering community, and ways to mitigate this problem and improve energy performance, and get rid of some of the issues that go along with thermal bridging. We have an LCA working group, which focuses on LCA education, tries to get beyond just looking at global warming potential and climate issues. And certainly we know in LCA there are other important environmental metrics to look at, so we want to broaden beyond that. We have the carbon working group, which is focused on climate change. Presently, we're developing resources for the SE 2050 project. And then we have the SE 2050 subcommittee, which is, Megan will tell us a little more about the activities of that group. So really a broad range of exciting activities. There's plenty more we could be doing. We welcome new members as well. So if anyone out there has a desire to work on these issues, we would welcome your applications. I must say just a little bit about resilience. It's been a question: what is the connection between resilience and sustainability? Are they the same? Should they be lumped in the same category? I mean, they're not the same. They're definitely interrelated. I think really resilience is central to sustainability, because if you don't have resilient structures, then they could be damaged in environmental events, disasters, that sort of thing, and you have a loss of materials, need to rebuild, a waste of resources. But you really need to look at the risks, because resilient construction often requires more materials and may have higher initial impacts in construction. So it may not be warranted if the risk of damage is small, and you sort of need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Figure out what the threats are in the location where the project is being built, and there are tools available to help do that, especially in the seismic world with the like SP3 software. And that kind of raises the question of mitigation versus adaptation, which I think is an important concept in terms of climate change. In my mind, mitigation is what we do to reduce the impacts of climate change. So that's reducing carbon emissions today so that we don't have as much to adapt to in the future. And that's really where the resiliency needs to come in, not only responding to current levels of activity, but what's going to come down the road with climate change. Even if we manage to stamp down the emissions in the near term, we're still going to see rising sea levels. There's things that are already locked into place that we're going to need to understand and deal with. I might just say just a couple of words about what we're doing at my own company, SGH. We have a Sustainability and Resilience Committee, which is a dedicated group of engineers who are working in 3 subgroups: marketing, education, and operations. We're also looking into streamlining the extraction of structural material quantities from our Revit models so that we can start calculating embodied carbon for our projects. We're already doing some consulting with clients on LCA and embodied carbon reductions. And we also have a building enclosure practice, which includes energy performance work passive house projects, that sort of thing. So we're addressing sustainability in a few different ways. So I guess in closure, I just want to say, I mean, it's really a great time to be a structural engineer. There's probably never been a time that when our profession has been called upon to face, to play such a critical role. And really, we can make a bigger impact on sustainability with the work we do in our profession than what we do at home. We spend a lot of time thinking about recycling and doing the right thing in our own personal lives, but really, when we design projects that get built, we can have a much bigger impact on sustainability in our profession than we can at home. So it's time really to rise to the challenge, to take our education, our experience, our ingenuity, and apply that to the defining crisis of our time in climate change.
Mark, thank you for that. That was great. A lot to unpack there. And I think your really broad perspective of sustainability, both encouraging us to look at it broadly, but also the long term were a great point and great opening for our discussion. And my gosh, congratulations, a tremendous amount being done. You cited many initiatives there. Let me say to to the people online, if any of you are interested in drilling down more on any of the initiatives Mark just mentioned, or that Megan and Will may mention, drop a note in the chat, and I'll try to give the opportunity for us to delve deeper. And finally, Mark, I have to say that's probably the best explanation of the similarities and differences between sustainability and resilience I've heard. So thank you very much for that. So great. Let's move on to Megan. Megan, welcome again. Please help us focus on embodied carbon. What is it? Why is it important? How does it relate to sustainability? What is SEI doing about it? Mark mentioned the SE 2050 initiative. So if you could give us a little more information on that, that would be helpful.
Sure, thanks, Glenn. I guess starting at a really basic level, the environmental impact of a building is really broken down into two parts. So either the operational impacts or the embodied impacts. And so obviously those operational impacts are those that come from the daily operation and use of the building. And while the embodied impacts are those that essentially occur up to that building being occupied and being used by its tenants. So everything from the raw material extraction to manufacturing of those materials into structural materials, and then the construction impacts. So, as these buildings have becoming more operationally efficient, we are seeing that embodied carbon is really entering that the spotlight as a metric that we need to start reducing. So as the structure makes up a large portion of a building's embodied carbon, we structural engineers can have a big impact on the environmental performance of the structures we design. And so, these topics of reducing embodied carbon has been a major thing the SEI Sustainability Committee has been researching, among other things, as Mark has mentioned. We've been publishing a lot of documents on it and presenting at lots of conferences on that. And I guess a lot of that has really then led to the committee spearheading this SEI SE 2050 commitment program, which did officially launch in November, and it's aimed at the structural engineering profession to do their part in getting to net zero embodied carbon by 2050. So I guess a little bit of history on how that program came to be. So with embodied carbon kind of being a pretty big focal point within kind of the AEC industry over the last few years, it's got a lot of people at the Carbon Leadership Forum, which is a group out of the University of Washington, to start incubating this idea of needing to get to net zero embodied carbon by 2050. And they issued a challenge to the structural engineering profession last summer, stating that all engineers shall understand, reduce, and ultimately eliminate embodied carbon in their projects by 2050. And so I guess in parallel, when they were kind of incubating this idea and issuing the challenge, they did approach the SEI Sustainability Committee, as SEI is basically the leading national professional organization for structural engineers. But they approached us with this idea of creating the US's commitment program to their challenge. And so This challenge and commitment program is paralleled a lot off of the AIA 2030 commitment and the Architecture 2030 challenge. And so, those two groups have been great partners with us in helping us develop this program. But for the program, we have essentially set a pretty low bar of entry. We really want to get as many structural engineering firms engaged in embodied carbon and embodied carbon reduction. We have some pretty low bars of entry at the current moment. So it's really just about getting a commitment letter signed on by your firm's leadership and uploaded to our website, se2050.org. We do require firms to create an embodied carbon action plan within the first 6 months. So really just starting to get the firms to think about what they're doing in that space and what they can do. And then we're requiring a minimum amount of embodied carbon data be submitted to our database, which will hopefully launch sometime middle of this year. And so then obviously as the program progresses and more firms are signing on, we're hoping to start to set thresholds and limits, and the requirements could get a little bit more stricter than it currently is. But on the website, we have a ton of resources provided, as kind of Mark was alluding to, that he's been spearheading. There's a lot of great information out there on embodied carbon, on what we can do as structural engineers to reduce it. And we're hoping to start to really vamp up our education over this next year. So definitely be on the lookout for some upcoming webinars on the topic. And then I guess I'll just close this little intro on with less than 3 months of this program being out there to the world, we have 19 firms across the country signed up. And the really exciting part that us on the committee have been finding is that, it's both large and small firms, some firms that we've never even heard of. And so we're really getting that word out there, and people are interested and engaged. And, we have over 500 people, signed up to get updates on the program, monthly. And so anyway, it's an exciting time, as Mark had mentioned, to be a structural engineer. I think we're finally at a point where we as a profession can step up and really make an impact and take on this whole topic. And so it's exciting.
Megan, thank you very much for that. And again, congratulations. And boy, there's a tremendous amount. I am aware of the effort and the energy that's going into this, and it's most impressive. And for those of you who have not had a chance to look at the SE 2050 website, se2050.org, I encourage you to go on. There's a lot of fantastic material on there. So thank you very much. So Will, let's turn to you next. We've read about the very proactive approach the UK government has taken in climate change. So if you could fill us in on what is happening in practice in the UK with carbon reduction. And also, we welcome your comments on any of the other topics that Megan and Mark just touched on.
Sure, thanks, Glenn. It's quite funny to be attending a discussion like this in the US when you've been working all day in the UK, and I'm still getting used to it. But so yeah, fantastic to be invited to one of the SEI events. We obviously should get all of you back to a UK event in the near future. So thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the UK government and what we're trying to do as a country in response to the climate emergency. In a few months' time, it'll be the 2-year anniversary since the UK government passed or updated our laws to commit to 100% decarbonisation of the country by 2050. And that's quite important. Now, I think we were one of the first major economies in the world, if not the first, to do that. And others have followed, and I have a list on my desktop that I update regularly. This gets longer and longer, which is obviously great. But in the last 2 years, I think we have seen things change within our industry as well as others. Public perceptions change as a result of everything that's been talked about by politicians, and it's just become quite normal to talk about the climate emergency and sustainability and decarbonisation. I am going to chip in with something that was mentioned before in terms of defining sustainability, because I think I like to think of it as I take the analogy of running, right? So if you run at a sustainable rate, you're running at a speed that you can keep up for the entire length of time you want to go and run for. I think if you Google definition of sustainability, you get something like the ability to be maintained at a certain rate or a certain level. And that gives us quite a good measure, because we know that what we've been doing for so long now is not sustainable. We can't keep putting carbon into the atmosphere at the rate that we have done in the past. We will just cause temperature rises to to keep going up, and it will be a never-ending battle. And no matter how resilient and how adaptable we make our structures, we're fighting a losing battle because the forces of nature will just get stronger and stronger. So we have to tackle sustainability and resilience at the same time. And I really like Mark's way of defining those two things. So here in the UK, this law was passed committing to 100% decarbonisation. It was really important because up until then, the law had said 80% decarbonisation by 2050, and everybody assumed that they were in the other 20%, so they didn't have to worry about it too much. All of a sudden, it was like, it's everyone. So that was pretty massive. And in 2019, there's quite a lot of things all started to happen at the same time. One of which was, the first movement that happened was architects declare. It was swiftly followed by structural engineers declare. And for people listening, if you haven't heard of that before, do just type in structural engineers declare or go to structuralengineersdeclare.com to see what it was about. But this was our sort of equivalent of the SE 2050 commitment. But I think it'd be fair to say they're sort of cousins rather than brothers or sisters. There's some quite fundamental differences that I'd be keen to sort of explore this evening. And I'm not biased, because there are things in SE 2050 that require far more commitment from the signatories than there are in structural engineers declare. But I think that the most important thing we did was that we went quite broad. We're not just focusing on carbon, we're not just focusing on climate. I think the full title is Structural Engineers Declare a Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. And that is quite tricky. That's quite a lot of stuff to try and deal with at once. And it is a completely intertwined, difficult problem. Biodiversity, habitat loss, the need to rewild, this all needs to happen at the same time as reducing carbon emissions if we're going to hit this idea of a sustainable world, a world that can continue to exist in the same way, for as long until the sun burns out or something, very long time. So that's one complexity. The other complexity that's quite key in this is timescales, and we can't lose track of the fact that the IPCC have set a carbon budget for the world. They've done models and science and stuff, and predicted that if we emit more than a certain number of gigatons of carbon, more likely than not, we will see 1.5 degrees C global warming. And at the rate that we're emitting carbon, that runs out in 6 years and 11 months, more or less, beyond which we are more likely than not to see 1.5 degrees global warming. So there is some urgency to this, and we can't be pushing the problem to the future at the same time, but we also need to be acting now. And the largest role we have, as Mark and Megan have both alluded to, is all around carbon. It's about carbon reduction. We need to set the bar higher. We need to work out how we're going to get there. We need to share guidance with one another on how we design lower carbon, how we reuse whenever possible. And then I think most important of all, we need to continue to advocate for change. So just because you and those around you have started to talk in these terms, talk about carbon, talk about sustainability, that won't be enough by itself. We need to have these conversations on a regular basis with the people who aren't necessarily interested in it, because that's how this is all started to accelerate in the last couple of years, is because of those sort of grassroots conversations, and we need plenty more of those over the next decade, I think.
Great, thank you, Will. Great perspectives. I do later in the discussion, Mark and Megan, want to return to the question of legislation and whether that's desirable and necessary in the States, but I want to hold that until we get a little bit more background material. But Will, thank you very much for that. As a runner and cyclist myself, I love your definition of sustainability. It really resonates. And I think there's also, as an older runner and cyclist, there's an element of resiliency in there too to be thought about in that model as well. So thank you for that. And boy, the projections of the short time frame to potentially to a 1.5 sea rise is a little bit frightening. So it does bring the urgency of this to home. We have a lot of questions coming in on the chat now, so I want to turn to those so we can capture as many of them as possible. And the first one, any of the three of you may pick up as you please, but a question from Fraser is, do you have any recommendations on how consultants can help push forward more circular methods of construction? Up to you, who wants to pick that up?
Go, Will.
we're all being too polite, aren't we? My Britishness is off.
Go ahead, Will.
I mean, I would have a, there's a couple of things around this topic that are quite interesting. One is that we cannot be designing circular without also be designing for those carbon emissions we just talked about. And I say to people again, this is difficult because we have to minimize the emissions of the next 10 years as well as the emissions of the next 100. And clearly designing things that can be reused at end of life 40 years from now is as important as designing them to be low carbon now. And that makes your job, Fraser, really tricky, I'm afraid, and I'm very sorry. But it's all right because we're quite good at dealing with tricky problems as engineers. The thing I say to people is think about, if you came along to a building now that somebody had designed 60 years ago and you had to do something with it, what would it be that you would have wished that they had done? And I don't think it's very often actually that you wish that they would have designed for much higher floor loads and put lots of redundancy in things and oversized everything and made all the beams the same size, because we generally find that you can adapt structures, you can strengthen structures. We know how to do all that, and I think we all agree we're going to get pretty good at that over the next 50 years. Generally, the things we wish people had done would have been to keep really good records of what was in there, maybe even stamp sizes on things, maybe, I don't know, write how much rebar is inside of a concrete beam or something. Record keeping makes things so much easier. I know this, my last job at Arrett before I left to go and work at the institution was a reuse job, and we had great records of what had been built, and it made justifying putting 2 new stories on top of an existing building relatively straightforward. So for me, it's about records, and it's about thinking of what that person in 50 years time might want to try and do with it and what they're going to wish you would have done.
Excellent. Mark, I know you've done some research on design for reconstruction. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good segue. Because what Will's talking about, I think one of the things is really design for deconstruction, and it's I agree. It's in the near. It's not going to help us solve climate change in the near term because we're talking designing buildings which will hopefully be around for 75 or 100 years or more, right? So that's really when the payback comes in for the strategy, because the idea is when the building reaches the end of the life, you can take it apart and hopefully reuse those materials directly in new construction, thereby sort of eliminating the whole extraction production cycles of new materials. The project you're thinking of, Glenn, is I think the deconstructible composite slab project. Currently with typical steel construction and steel deck and shear studs and concrete, the way a lot of office buildings and other buildings are constructed, these are not deconstructible. You cannot, basically the best you can do is maybe demolish them, maybe crush the concrete, separate the steel, and recycle it. But you certainly cannot reuse those elements. So the idea was to use a system with precast planks and clamping connections that would attach the planks to the steel framing, the beams, so that in 100 years, maybe an optimistic scenario, we'll see, but you could take it apart and reuse those elements in a new building. And you can really take that line of thinking with really anything you build, whether it's wood framed, concrete, steel. How are you putting this together? Are they standardized? If somebody comes along in 100 years, are they going to be able to figure out how you put it together? And that's where the documentation comes in that we'll mention, but maybe also, having things be visible and comprehensible to that future engineer.
Very good. Thank you. We have a question from Janae. Janae, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but he's a student and he'd like to know how to participate in carbon initiatives. And let me extend his question a bit to all of you who might like to speak also to what is happening at university levels at all in terms of carbon reduction or sustainability in general. And how can Janae and other students learn how to calculate embodied carbon? There's a lot to deal with there.
I could talk a little bit about that. So yeah, I guess the committee in general, both the SE 2050 and the Sustainability Committee has been seeing a lot of outreach from students lately on how they can get a bit more involved. And I think we've been trying to tackle that as the committee, like how can we use these people who are interested in helping us out and what they can do. So I think we have been seeing some classes coming into curricula in education, which has been great, focused on embodied carbon and sustainability topics. And so I guess, yeah, trying to ask for more of that and trying to see that more integrated into just standard curriculum. I think and the other thing, we're trying to partner with some students to kind of help us out on some projects. And so trying to figure out better avenues for that and outreach. And I think there'll be more to come from that, at least from the Sustainability Committee in the future. And then, I think students can definitely play around with some of the embodied carbon tools that are out there. There's definitely some that are out there for free to download, as well as ones that will give you access as a student for free. I think, playing around with, even just quantifying different embodied carbon or structural material quantities of different designs and looking at what that looks like from an LCA standpoint is just a really great way to kind of get your feet wet. I think though, and what I kind of see the biggest things that students can really focus on, because a lot of that stuff can be learned in practice. A lot of the LCA and all these strategies can be learned once you're in the professional world, but really focusing on I think a lot of your soft skills as well. I think, we as engineers in general aren't the best at explaining our ideas all the time and being communicative. And I can't stress how much, especially currently or more recently in my career, seeing that importance and really being able to convey your ideas well, being able to draw what you're trying to explain. And I think all of those things will really benefit us in the future and will benefit yourself as well in making yourself a bit more well-rounded as an engineer, because we know that the classes and the rigor that you have to go through in an undergrad and graduate profession, is very focused on a lot of the technical more basics and fundamentals of structural engineering, which it should be, but I definitely think focusing on those soft skills would benefit you a lot.
Fantastic. I think you touched on just about everything there. Great advice. Thank you, Megan. Will, please.
If I could add to that as well, I'd say to any students listening, don't forget the amount of sort of power you have to influence the curriculum that's taught at your university. The curriculum that a university set changes from year to year. We're seeing more change in the construction industry now, at least over in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, than we've seen in a long time. And universities are good at responding to that. And if the students start saying, we want to learn about carbon, we want to learn about circular economy and reuse, that will make it into the curriculum far quicker than if we try and impose it through legislation change and things like that. So, do speak up and speak to your tutors and speak to your professors about these topics and ask them, what do they know and what can they help you to learn?
That's great advice, Will. Having been involved in some educational reform initiatives, I agree with that. The students probably certainly have the most powerful voice there. Mark.
Yeah, one more quick thing on that is that also, see what's going on in terms of your student professional activities at the university you're at or college. A lot of the student chapters of ASCE are, are getting into sustainability. And if not there, then also consider, the national level, because we've certainly had students on the Sustainability Committee in the past, and they're, it's a great way to engage in these issues.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Thank you, Mark. We're going to go in a little bit different direction now with a really great and I think tough question, which is what are the incentives for companies to take on the challenge of sustainability and to take them on more seriously and maintain the SE 2050 commitment? I'm sure you all have thought a lot about this and have faced challenges there. So can you address this question for us, please?
I can talk a little bit about that. Yeah,
Okay.
and I guess from a commitment program perspective, we definitely have talked about this a lot on the committee as to what are these incentives that we're offering. And honestly, I think we've been seeing, and I've been seeing this a lot in my own practice, is these firms that are jumping out and getting ahead of this and really, the 19 firms that we already have committed to the program, I think are going to see a lot of benefits by being an quote unquote early adopter of embodied carbon reduction. And I think that's going to pay off, tenfold. And so I guess, my firm committed to the program, and I was really able to get them to do that by, touting some of the marketing benefits from doing it. I think, our architects and building owners are much more open and interested in hearing about sustainability topics and what we can do as a profession and what we can bring to the table than maybe some of your older structural engineers that you've worked with in the past. I think people just are really interested in the topic and engaged and want to hear what we can do. And I think I've been seeing that as such a great benefit to the firm and in general. And so I think being able to be a leader in that space, I think is a really great incentive. And, by being able to point to, your firm's name up on the website as a committed firm, I think it says a lot. And yeah, but we've been talking about other potential incentives and haven't landed on anything specific yet. But I think we'll be, reflecting after kind of a year of the commitment program and probably reaching out to firms to kind of see what benefits they're seeing from joining. And I think we'll be kind of covered in that sense.
That's certainly
Mark,
powerful, Megan. Will and Mark, do you have
Yeah, I mean,
add to
I was
that?
going to say, if I can reflect for a second, in 2019, people were asking that same question of structural engineers to Claire and of all the initiatives that are going on, and nobody asks it anymore. Nobody. Every firm's USP is that they're the leanest, greenest, cleanest structural engineering firm in the country. And it's obviously, USP doesn't work as an acronym anymore when everyone's doing it, but it's good business and it's become the norm very quickly, and it's become so normalized that it's, if a graduate goes for an interview at a firm and they're asked if they have any questions for their interviewer, they're going to ask you about your sustainability credentials, what you're doing about the world in which they have inherited. And if you turn around and you say you haven't done much, I mean, they'll look at you in the way that they'd look at you if you said, well, do you want to sit in the smoking section or the non-smoking section of this office, right? It's just bizarre now. It's how quickly it will change. You want to be ahead of that. Absolutely.
Great story, Will. Mark, any thoughts on this one?
What I was going to mention is just the potential for the young engineers who are coming to SGH, and that this is what they're passionate about, and to be able to say that you've joined this program and are committed to working on these issues is a huge plus, not only for recruitment but also for retention, I think.
So thank you, Mark. And that's actually a segue for a question that came to my mind as we were talking about this issue. I think it seems a lot of the initiative and enthusiasm and commitment to sustainability and climate action is coming from a younger generation. Yet to affect change in organizations, you sometimes have to work your way up the corporate ladder, if you will, to get the decision makers to adopt. Any experiences and advice to offer perhaps young enthusiasts who work in a firm that are maybe slower to adopt sustainable practices than they would like to see? What should the younger group be doing here?
I would advocate for just going and doing it anyway. And this is what I say to a lot of young engineers, just go and, there are videos out there, there's guidance documents you can read that tell you all about carbon, how to calculate it, loads of stuff on the SE 2050 website. Just go and have a go anyway, and then go to your boss and say to your boss, okay, look, I've looked at this building and it looks like all the carbon is in the core. It's all in the stability system for this building. So could we focus our energy on making that more efficient? They're going to turn around and say yes. They're going to say, oh, more efficient there. Okay, fine. And, I'd just say just go and do it and don't shut up about it. And you'll find that things will change over the next couple of years. And if you just drive it, it will happen. And then if still nothing's happening in your firm after 2 years, go and work for somebody who cares and just quit, go and work somewhere else. But give it a chance. do it yourself to start with and push it, and I think that change will happen.
Okay, great, great answer. This one is to Megan or Mark. Will has told us about the decisive moves the UK government has made to basically legislate the drive to net zero. What is your thought about the desirability or even necessity of doing that in the States? Will we get where we need to go through the drive of the institutions and the practitioners signing up, or do we need a heavier hammer than that? Any thoughts? If you could speak to John Kerry, for example, now, what would you encourage him to do in this regard?
I'll start off, Mark, and then you can finish. That's a tough question. I honestly would hope that the profession could step up and do its part without needing to be mandated. I also can see the benefit, though, of some type of legislation happening or some requirements, because I do think it'll could potentially make things happen quicker. Yeah, I think a combination of both will probably be more the reality. I think it would be great, though, if the profession would take this on and take up the charge and need little legislation behind that. But I guess I do see the benefit in kind of having a combination approach.
Can either of you, Megan or Mark, are you aware of any examples of this happening at state or municipal level in the States now? I'm talking about
Megan,
legislation.
I think you're probably more familiar with the Marin County work as one example.
Yeah.
Yep. So I was just going to mention, so we are starting to see some legislation happening with the kind of the US's first low carbon concrete code that was adopted in the Bay Area over a year ago now. And so I definitely see that as a start and a really great step at focusing on a very low hanging fruit in concrete and what we can do as an industry and what can be mandated in cement limits and GWP limits on concrete. And so this was just one specific example in a small county in the Bay Area, and the hope is that the code will be adopted could be adopted throughout local jurisdictions across the country. And we have been seeing a lot of interest in a lot of the major cities across the country. And so the hope would be that that code could be what am I trying to say? There's definitely certain limits that are set in the code that would need to be calibrated based on wherever you are practicing within the country. And then, but the general code language could suffice across the country. So I could see similar things happening in that space in the future.
Okay, thank you.
I can respond just quickly on the broader question. I mean, of whether we need help from legislation. I do think we do, really. If we're going to cut CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030, is only less than years away now. It's a pretty big lift, really, and participation from structural engineers, but ultimately, if we had some sort of carbon tax or something that would really drive the demand for reductions, I think that would help tremendously.
Yeah. In terms, thank you, Mark. In terms of it triggers another question now. In terms of our rate of progress towards net zero by 2050, what does that curve look like? Is there low-hanging fruit now where we can accelerate the process? Or are we hampered by a lack of technology and a complete understanding of the path to get there? What does that path look like?
Okay, well, why don't I tell you, we wrote a paper in October of last year where we tried to work out what this curve had to look like. So we took the IPCC's carbon budget, we divided that up, and we subdivided until we got down to what we consider were likely to be building structures in buildings. So take infrastructure out, take all the other industry out, left you with about 10% of the budget you were starting with. It gave us a budget of like 20 gigatons of carbon to spend on building structures around the world until we hit 1.5 degrees global warming. And if you then plot like kilograms of carbon per square meter and what we think is currently average at one end of a graph at the year 2021, we were doing it 2020 at the time, but not much has changed. And then along the bottom, you go all the way up to 2050. You don't get a straight line. You get a line that has to curve down because the area under that has to add up to this 20 gigaton budget we have.
Right.
And so you get this curve that actually has to move quite quickly, pretty soon. And I think it worked out at something like a 10% reduction every year, which sounds scary when you imagine doing that every year for 30 years. But actually, if you just say to yourself, fine, 2021, we're going to do 10% less carbon than we did last year. I think that's pretty achievable. That's about, making sure your utilizations of your members are that bit higher, not baking some fat into it, questioning a few sort of key design decisions with the architects you're working with and the client, and you've got 10%, you're done. That's your target for this year. And then we'll work out next year. We'll do 10% again next year and we'll keep going. I think it's something like that.
Very good. Thank you. We have a question from Rick, who I think is joining us from Japan. He talks about resilience being a big thing in Japan and is curious about the connection between sustainability and structural health monitoring. Thoughts on that?
I guess the structural health monitoring, I feel like at least what we've been doing in the Bay Area is more related to, seismic resiliency. And so that kind of tie and link between being able to monitor your building, for example, after a seismic event, and being able to, I guess, target a quicker retrofit or rehabilitation or even just the initial investigation into that structure as being really helpful. So I definitely see that as another strategy of in resilient design, and then how that all ties into a more sustainable structure. But I don't know if Mark or Will, you had any other comments to add?
Okay, great. We have one from Ruprasad, who I know. Hi, Ruprasad. Good to hear from you. He asks, how can the aspect of sustainability be incorporated in our licensing system in the US? Great question. We have all of these criteria that are aimed at the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And I'm sort of rephrasing his question a bit, but it begs the question, shouldn't resilience and sustainability be part of our credentialing? I'm seeing nodding heads.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. If it is such an important issue, the timeline is a big question. I think these credentialing programs are, it takes time to really make changes, but well worth working towards doing that, in my opinion.
Okay, great, fantastic. Any other thoughts? Will, is this finding its way into, for example, IStructE chartering in the UK, to your knowledge?
Really glad you asked.
Sorry?
Because I'm probably not best placed to talk about licensing in the US. And
No,
UK.
How
it works, but I'll tell you about the UK.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When we started on this journey at the beginning of last year, we started with the view of we're going to start getting guidance out to as many members as possible. But obviously guidance is just that, and it's not compulsory reading, although it is obviously best practice. At the start of this year, we started looking at our chartership program, which is kind of like our licensing. There's a couple of different aspects of this in the UK, but we're reviewing the whole thing with the view being we absolutely have to put sustainability at the heart of that, because the mandate we've set for ourselves is to put sustainability on a par with life safety, given that they are effectively the same thing. They're both about preventing deaths. It's just the immediacy of the problem. Watch this space. It's going to take a couple of years before it works its way through to the point where you're actually being tested on it as a graduate, but the wheels have been very swiftly set in motion. And I would advocate that you do the same in the US, of course.
Great. We've got a really great question here, and our time is wearing thin, so I want to make sure we're able to get to it. And which is, and the name is Abhijit. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He's from India, and he's wondering what can be done in the developing world, countries like India, where there's a lot that's needed to be done, but is not happening in such an organized sector there. And this is not part of his question, but it sort of begs the point of the fact that the entire globe is in this together. So, one country or portions of the world can do their part, and if the others aren't, we're not making progress. So, who would like to speak to that?
I'd love to go first, but I'd like to hear somebody else follow up as well, because I've got quite strong views on this. I mean, we talked about carbon budgets. I don't think that carbon budget gets divided up equally around the world. I think there's a very strong argument to say that many of us have spent a lot of ours already and need to decarbonize far faster than other parts of the world. And I think that's important to sort of get on board with and be okay with. And then I think the next most important thing that then follows is the idea of knowledge sharing. And it's really good that we can have these conversations now over the internet, because it means that we can be talking about this topic with our friends on the opposite side of the world who are tackling all the same problems at us, but maybe don't have, there are university lecturers around the corner from me who are working on this right now kind of thing. So we should get this thing sooner. There's no reason why we can't share this knowledge, almost immediately around the world. And that is the way out of this, right? So I think it's about knowledge sharing, it's about working together, it's about institutions from across the globe trying to sort of pair up and spread that knowledge around.
Right.
Has to be, doesn't it?
And there is a lot of fantastic information out there. I'm well familiar with what's happening in SEI, and Megan mentioned the SE 2050 website is a wealth of information. I'm also very familiar with what's going on in the institution, and fantastic resources being put out there. And that's your primary job now, isn't it, Will? Making sure that all of that gets out there. So the point is that this material is available to the world, not just our respective countries. Great, fantastic. Well,
I just might add one more thought on that. I agree, totally agree with the knowledge sharing, but I just wanted to say, and maybe it goes both ways, because there are, I think, construction technology and so on being used are more material efficient, maybe more labor intensive, but more material efficient.
Yeah.
And there are things we could, I think, learn as well.
Okay, great. That's a fantastic point, Mark. Thank you very much. So I'm going to pose one question and ask you for a very quick answer, because we've only got about 5 minutes left. But what final words and advice would each of you like to leave as a challenge or a thought for our profession to the people listening in today? 1 or 2 liners would be most appreciated. What do you want our listeners to take away today?
I'd say that I really think we need to see our profession step up and take on embodied carbon before someone else does it for us. I could easily see the alternative solution of, architects stepping in and doing this if we're not willing to take on that ropes. And I don't think we want to be dictated by, having limits set onto us on our structure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, thinking that a little bit differently is, we have this opportunity to really be proactive and be on the other side of the table for once, in these meetings, and actually be able to drive decisions and, have a lot to say. So I think, again, alluding to Mark's initial comments on, it's an exciting time to be a structural engineer. And I think we just need to step up to the challenge.
Fantastic. Great message. Who wants to go next?
Sure. So I would say, yes, it's clear we have a steep hill to climb, but I don't want people to go away discouraged. I mean, there's so much we can do. It's not just what we can do. There are other things happening to help us in terms of the electrical grid and new improvements in manufacturing of structural materials, maybe new materials. It's all coming together. And we're engineers. I think we're in this profession because we like challenges, we like problems, we like solving problems. And really, this is a big problem to solve. And I think a lot of us are going to get a lot of satisfaction about, in dealing with them.
Great. Okay. Will, you get the last word.
Yeah, the last word. It's a shame they already stole my words. No, I'd leave you with one thing, which is 10% reduction this year. 10%.
Very
Go
good.
and find it. Do it in 2021.
Great target. And it's there, isn't it? If we look for it and strive for it. So fantastic. Thank you so much, Will, Megan, Mark. This was great. And I want to give our thanks to the stellar SEI team who works hard in the background to put great programs like this together. And thanks to all of you who are out there for attending. Just before we close, just a few reminders of some upcoming SEI virtual events. On March 18th, we will be continuing our SEI Standards series, and our next session will be on ASCE 43. On March 30th, the Global Activities Division of SEI will be holding a session on COVID-19. And continuing on April 7th, our next SEI session will be on the ASCE report card. So lots of good content coming up. I hope to see you at those events as well. So, and by the way, if you didn't have a chance to write everything down that I just said, all of this information about upcoming events is available on the SEI virtual events page. So this concludes today's session. Thank you all again. I hope to see you again soon. Bye.